Welcome to Politics and Psychology. Today we are discussing election fraud, hypocrisy. November the 5th, 2024 was America's most recent presidential election. On November the 6th, it was determined that Donald J. Trump was to become the president-elect, with Donald Trump receiving 50% of the popular vote and Kamala Harris receiving 48.3% of the popular vote. Now, although many ballots are still being counted and in some states being recounted, the current count is 76,733,150 votes for Trump and 74,191,964 votes for Harris. On November the 6th, shortly before dawn and before the race had been officially called, Donald Trump gave his election victory speech. Also, starting on November 6th, this was the day that Donald Trump stopped making claims of election fraud. He also stopped saying that there was cheating with the counting of ballots. In fact, even on Election Day at 4:30 p.m., former President Donald Trump posted on Truth Social that there was, quote, a lot of talking about massive cheating, end quote, in Pennsylvania. Yet, when the Associated Press called for his victory in Pennsylvania at 2:24 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, with Trump leading by 175,000 votes, Trump and his campaign suddenly stopped their claims of voting fraud. They also made no more mention, even to this day, of any fraud happening or cheating of ballot counting happening in Pennsylvania. In fact, it was only once Trump heard that his number of votes in Pennsylvania were 175,000 and that he was likely statistically going to win. At this time, did he conclude and preemptively declare himself the winner. Now, to be fair, for Kamala Harris to have won the election, as far as statistically, then by losing Pennsylvania, then there was no way that she could have had the numbers and the Electoral College votes to win. So Trump was correct in predicting that he did win the presidential election by having won the votes from Pennsylvania. The problem with that is that since his election loss in 2020 through the election day in 2024, nearly every day, Trump has posted on social media or made comments in the news and during his speeches that that election was rigged, quote unquote, or stolen, quote unquote. He even went so far as to blame the company that manufactured the voting machines and claimed that the machines were faulty, broken, and rigged for President Biden. This resulted in a defamation lawsuit brought by Dominion Voting Machines against Fox News. And the reason Fox News was named is because they found that because Fox News heavily promoted Trump's false claims of election fraud as a direct result of Dominion's voting machines, specifically, Fox promoted the message that Dominion machines were responsible for Trump losing the election, and therefore they defamed or negatively affected their reputation and the quality of their manufacturing product. That's why Fox News was named. But because of this lawsuit, Fox News agreed to pay $787.5 million to the Colorado-based Dominion company. And they actually settled this moments before the lawyers for Dominion were about to begin their opening arguments. Now, that was in 2023. So that means that Fox promoted Trump's lies of election interference for over 3 years. But unfortunately, Fox News was not the only one to aggressively promote election fraud lies. In the 2022 midterm elections, many Republican candidates who wanted to attract voters who were very loyal to Trump, they began to join in on promoting the election fraud allegations, and they also began to publicly question the validity of the 2020 result. And for many of these campaigns, this was a major part of their pitch and a major part of their messaging for their campaigns and their campaign promises. And it worked. because in response, in 2022, 40 states elected a 2020 election denier. And this goes from a multitude of positions, whether it was local or all the way up to governor. So we had governors, secretaries of state, and attorney generals for Congress who were election deniers who won their elections. And in total, 229 candidates with the election denying claims won their elections. Nearly 2 years later, as of January 2024, there were 127 members of Congress still in office who previously refused to vote to certify the 2020 election results. And on Election Day, just a few days ago, November 2024, 143 election deniers won their races for Congress. So your senators and your House of Representatives, that's where these 143 election deniers were elected to now serve on behalf of America. So we can see that promoting claims of election fraud has proved very beneficial to political hopefuls and for those seeking re-election. We can also see that out of all of the elected officials who denied the results of the 2020 election, claiming election fraud and voter fraud, every one of these deniers are also members of the Republican Party. So the Republican Party's leaders' use of these conspiracy theories was partly what significantly persuaded masses of individuals and potential voters to also believe that if I'm going to vote for truth and fair elections, then I need to recognize that if they're all saying this, then they must be the only ones who are really telling the truth. And so I'm going to vote for whoever I think is telling the truth. And because the Republican Party, they continue to promote the allegations of election fraud, then these members of Congress and even local elected officials, they would make comments on social media, on TV, on podcasts, at rallies, and in newspapers. So if you were not a person who heavily followed politics or law or any of the election fraud cases and found that they were not found to be true, if you didn't listen to any of those, but listen to just social media as your news source, then you're going to believe the person or the comment that's being said the most often, and you're going to believe that to be true. And speaking of social media, one of the world's largest social media platforms is X, and Elon Musk is the owner of that. And he joined in on the promotion of election fraud allegations when he decided to align himself with the candidate Donald J. Trump. And what Elon Musk did was he used his platform to not only have more messaging that was allowed now that it became X instead of Twitter. He was able to have it where it was now permissible to widely spread conspiracy theories, including election fraud theories, but he also altered the platform's algorithm to specifically promote posts about election fraud. Musk also created a, quote, election integrity community, end quote, on X. And he used his political action committee, which is how, a large group to pretty much anonymously donate money to an organization called the PAC or an entity called the PAC, and then that PAC can then give money to whomever it chooses without the individual donors being recognized or being known on the voting platforms. So with his Elections Integrity Committee, he used his own PAC to finance the paid ads on X that encourage members of this Election Integrity Committee and other X users to report, quote, voter fraud or irregularities. So looking at the timeline, we can see that since 2016, when the widespread allegations of election fraud were used throughout the Republican Party, then we have at least 8 years straight of election fraud claims, at least 8 years of filing lawsuits for election fraud allegations, and 8 years of social media posts specifically by members of the Republican Party about election fraud and voter or vote tampering. Yet this all ended as soon as Trump's re-election was announced, and the stop was virtually instant. On X, where Elon Musk election integrity community, they were constantly telling X users to post any voting irregularities and any appearances of voting fraud on election day. So let's look at that timeline. Starting at 12 a.m. on Tuesday, November the 5th, which was election day, there were over 200 posts per hour claiming observations of incidents of voter fraud or vote ballot tampering. By 12 p.m. on election day, there were over 700 posts per hour claiming proof or suspicion of election fraud. By the next morning, Wednesday at 12 a.m., there were 788 posted and reposted videos that hour alone claiming ballots were being illegally stored. Then by 2 a.m. Wednesday, they went down to 45 posts. And then by Thursday at 4 a.m., it went down to 4 posts of suspected election fraud. So how is it that there were between 200 and 788 posts per hour claiming not only election fraud, but claiming evidence of election fraud? But after Trump's win, we see only 4 posts? It's because of hypocrisy. Now, on this podcast, my goal is to focus on using science and objective information. So I am repeatedly mentioning Trump and Republicans, not because I'm causing anyone to vote for or against any political party, but because of the behaviors that were consistent with one group of individuals over another. So think about our comment today from a statistical and data-driven standpoint and observation objectively of behavior, not so much if you vote red or vote blue. But we can see, regardless of how you voted, that there was hypocrisy in the Republican Party by having 8 years of allegations of election fraud when Trump lost, but then when he won, it was crickets. And there has not been one claim made by a Republican of election fraud since Trump's win a few weeks ago. Even Joe Rogan, one of the most influential male podcasters, having more than 14 million followers for his podcast, and he's also a Trump supporter. The next day, when it was discovered that Trump did indeed win, then you hear Rogan laughing and joking about the election not being, quote, rigged. So after 8 years, now we see that, oh, well, since he won, then that's the proof that the election is no longer being rigged. Or is it more accurate that there were never any accurate observations, that there was never any proof of election fraud, but it was being promoted as a messaging for another reason? From a psychological reason, what are some of the things that you think would be a fear-based messaging of fraud or an election being stolen? Well, the most obvious answer, well, to me, since I'm a psychologist, but the most clear response would be because of manipulation. And what we see is manipulation because it's election fraud only when Trump or a Republican loses, but not when Trump or a Republican wins. That appears to be the case since at least 2016, specifically with Trump. Let's look back at their claims. Even on election day, there were very aggressive interviews and social media posts often in all capital letters. See our previous post about capital letters. And they were using or accusing polling sites, accusing the Democrat Party, accusing poll workers of cheating and hiding ballots, accusing falsely immigrants of illegally voting. And they were using all of these as quote unquote proof on social media. 788 videos in just 1 hour of this alleged proof of fraud. So what happened to all of that proof of fraud, all of those videos? Where is the questioning of the validity of those videos or the validity of the posts that were made, whether it was just by random X users, members of this, informal election integrity committee, the comments made by Trump, the comments made by Republicans, the comments made by Elon Musk? Where are all of these continued comments and accusations of election fraud? So there is none. And the reason why that is again because of it was not really a truth, but it was more of a manipulation. And the manipulation was done just for votes. If any of the allegations were true, there would have been proof, not only in the 2024 election, but also in the election starting in 2016, which is when Trump began promoting his conspiracy theories even more so. There would have been proof of at least one instance of support for vote or ballot tampering or voter fraud or election fraud. And unfortunately for the Republicans, the only evidence that we found was when there were Republicans who were tampering with ballots and committing election fraud on a small level, not enough to cause Donald Trump to lose or to win, but they still did it, and they were for the Republicans and not the alleged Democrat villains who were supposedly engaging in widespread election fraud. So we didn't see any evidence of support for the Republicans as the victims. There also would have been at least one legal win for any of the multiple lawsuits that the Republican filed for claims of election fraud and vote tampering as the reason for why Trump lost the 2020 election. But yet, there was not one, there was none. And despite there being none, this did not discourage the Republican Party or Donald Trump from continuing to make their claims of fraud. However, the making of claims of when you lose is nothing new for Donald Trump's behavior. Trump actually has a long history of making claims of fraud whenever he loses, even when it's not in politics. So, for example, if you ever watched The Apprentice, which I actually used to watch and enjoy, by the way, but whenever his Apprentice, the reality TV show, did not get an Emmy, then since he lost, basically, he would always reply, quote unquote, Emmys are all politics. And therefore, basically saying that the only reason why The Apprentice did not win is because the Emmys are about politics rather than the validity of the quality of the show. But going back to politics, it is Trump's desire to have a complete political, powerful victory that he is continually motivated by to promote constant claims of fraud. Let's look again at the 2016 presidential election. Now, he won the presidential election, but he won the Electoral College, not the popular vote. Hillary Clinton was the one who won the popular vote. But this was not good enough for Trump, and so he began to make numerous claims of election fraud and that he did not indeed lose the popular vote, but that he only had the loss because of wrongdoing. For the 2020 election, Trump promoted messages of anticipated election fraud and told voters in August 2020 that, quote, the only way we're going to lose this election is if the election is rigged, end quote. And then after his defeat by Joe Biden, his claims became more frequent and even more angering. And he was able to incite so much belief in his election fraud claims that he convinced thousands of people from nearly every state in our country to travel all the way to Washington, D.C. And when he gave his speech on January 6th, it was his continued claims during that speech of the election being stolen that led to the January 6th insurrection. And during that subsequent 7-hour riot, over 10,000 of the rioters made it into the Capitol grounds, and at least 2,000 made it inside the Capitol building. And all of this was done because Trump lost, and he was able to manipulate his followers into believing that the only reason why Trump lost is because the election was stolen. Now, from a psychological standpoint, it's extremely interesting that not only was he able to convince a massive amount of people that he lost the election, but he was able to convince them that they had the election stolen from them as well. Great, excellent mind games. But anyway, what does this mean for you? So first, reflect on your thoughts. If you ever heard of Trump's claims, which if you have social media or the news or YouTube, then I'm sure you heard at least one in the past 8 years. But when you heard, or if you heard of Trump's claims and the Republican Party's perpetuation of Trump's claims that there was election fraud as the only reason of why Trump lost that election, then ask yourself, what made me believe Trump's words? Also ask, if I did believe his words, what made it easier for me to believe his words, even though there was an absence of evidence for his words? And hopefully you'll be able to come to the realization that it was, again, manipulation. Now, there are other reasons. Now, it could be that you just wanted him to win and you didn't really care what he said. So that's a different group of individuals. I'm actually encouraging you to think about why I really only believed it once I heard him say it and I didn't really know what to believe, but I chose to believe him. So if you are an individual who chose to believe him because you believed what he said, not someone who believed or didn't believe, but just wanted him to win anyway. Not those group of individuals. But if you believed his words, then again, what made it easier for you to believe his words rather than thinking about or even considering that there was an absence of evidence for his words? And whether you voted for him or not, whether you are a Democrat or a Republican or an independent, my goal is to help us understand how political motivation happens and how Trump and the Republican Party were so easily and successfully able to manipulate masses of individuals, even to the point of death, into believing that there was indeed election fraud. So regardless, again, of your political party or affiliation, then ask yourself the two questions that I just posed to you, and also begin to accept the power of your vote, and accept that because you do have a tremendous voting power, then you can use that power to the best of your family and our country by making an informed decision. And that means not listening to everything you hear, and to look for at least one alternative answer or one explanation that's different from what you are being told in the news about a political candidate. Unfortunately, our legacy media is very divided. So, you can go to Fox for one message, to CNN for another message. So you have sources of very obvious, diverse beliefs and statements that you can go, okay, if I'm listening to Fox for 23 hours, let me listen to CNN or MSNBC for 1 hour, and vice versa. So find at least one alternative answer or explanation, or one alternative resource about one issue that will go opposite of what you are constantly being told on your primary source of information. 2, also look at the character and the background of the political news station, channel, or the candidates that you are listening to. And ask yourself, do they have integrity, or are they only one-sided? Do they change their minds or change their views or their statements when it's convenient? Or do they say what is true even when it will not benefit them? Or do they say whatever they think they need to say just to win votes and obtain favor with someone who has more power than you, such as Donald Trump? For example, in 2016, the Texas Republican Senator Ted Cruz was running as a presidential candidate against Donald Trump. And during a TV news interview, when questioned about the then candidate Donald Trump's claims of a rigged Republican primary election, Ted Cruz responded, quote, "Apparently, when anyone votes against him, it's an act of theft," end quote. So fast forward to 4 years later. After Trump lost that presidential election, Ted Cruz, in his speech on January 6, 2021, said that he was not going to vote to accept the Electoral College because he did not believe that Trump indeed had been defeated. So then what would make him go from one strong position, being on the record for going completely opposite only 4 years later, to one that favors the person who he was running against? Another example is politician Kari Lake. In 2000, also another news anchor. In 2022, Kari Lake was a Republican nominee for governor in Arizona, and at that time, she falsely claimed on her website that irregularities were occurring, quote, on a scope and scale sufficient to have changed the outcome of 2020, end quote. And by that statement, she was letting individuals know that I am questioning the validity because my website is having irregularities, that it's similar, if not the same, to what happened in the 2020 election, thereby implying it's the same reason why Trump did not win, because of irregularities, because of fraud, because of vote tampering or website tampering to discredit one candidate, mainly Kari Lake, over another. And this was her consistent messaging on the campaign trail. And it proved to be successful for her primary election, which is how she became the Republican nominee. But when she lost, for the general election, she repeatedly claimed that she didn't lose, not this time for the website, but this time she lost because the Maricopa County recorder, whose name is Stephen Riker, a fellow Republican, she claimed that he counted 300,000 invalid votes in the race, and because he counted invalid votes or invalid ballots, that was the only reason why she lost to the now Arizona Governor Katie Hobbs. And if you read any of the recent news, you'll see that she was sued by Mr. Riker because he repeatedly received death threats because individuals believed what Kari Lake was saying, that the only reason she lost is because of illegal action or election fraud, and also implying that the only reason why Trump lost, and so it was because of election fraud. So if she is triggering the emotions of individuals who are already listening to and believing that the only reason Trump lost in 2020 was because of fraud, and it has become so widespread that it's traveling all the way down to Arizona, and that's why she too lost the election, then she was able to trigger the emotions of enough people to then cause them to turn on their own party members and to try to threaten his very life. Let's also consider Fox News. When they were asked about their $787 million lawsuit for knowingly misleading the public and consistently providing disinformation regarding election fraud, the Fox lawyer said in a press conference, quote, "We never reported those statements to be true. All we ever did was provide viewers the true fact that these were allegations that were being made." So do you see how they twisted their words? They never acknowledged that they were knowingly giving disinformation or misinformation. They never acknowledged their responsibility. Instead, what they said was, well, we were being truthful. We were telling the truth about what someone said. But they did not accept responsibility that they told the truth about what someone said, but what that person said was a lie. And what that person said was leading to the cause of a nation being divided and having misinformation as the source of their division or their uncertainty of the integrity of our elections. And so, of course, that's why they settled out of court. But think about that when you're thinking about integrity. Is a person going to try to gaslight a nation or gaslight a news audience or gaslight a state into believing one narrative when they lose and then just stop talking about that narrative or ignore that narrative that triggered so many people when they win? Also, for integrity's sake, when you're considering your sources, think about, well, is that person really telling the truth, or are they manipulating words, as we saw what the Fox News lawyer was saying about her twisting of what truth was? So those are just 3 high-profile examples, but think about your own local level politics. If a candidate was registered as a Democrat and then lost a campaign, then changed his or her political party and ran again, then that's an indicator that that person cares more about winning than about serving. So when you're in one political party versus another, especially now with the current Republican Party, then you have a set of expectations of behaviors and morality that will be consistent throughout the Republican Party. And you will have similar beliefs and behaviors and what you support or don't support if you are a consistent Democrat voter. So if someone switches from the ideals of one party going to the very opposite for the other party, then that lets you know either they didn't really believe what they said that they believed in their original party politically, or they suddenly decided to change their mind because it was more advantageous to them. So at the local level, be cautious of anyone who is running for office after they have switched party. And it is common to go from one party to another. But if it happens from one year to the next, and you're also running a campaign, then that says a whole lot more about your political aspirations, more than it does about your desire to be aligned with a political party that values what you value and that cares for voters in a way that you also care for voters. So be very mindful of that. Also, if a candidate or a news station is repeatedly saying the same thing about a person or a political party, even if you agree with everything that they are saying, then still consider that there might be more information that they are not sharing with you. Consider that they are using a message that works, that gets them ratings, that gets them a loyal audience, but that loyal audience is being given a catered message or a customized message that may not include 100% of the truth. So try to listen to an independent news source in addition to your favorite news source to help compare your information and to make your vote powerful because it's an informed vote rather than a biased vote. Now, in following this advice, I want to also give you an alternative of the election fraud hypocrisy. So let's consider the Republican Party and what their response has been to the now silence of election fraud. So when questioned about the sudden silence and the disappearance of election fraud claims after Trump's recent win, then some Republicans are following in the footsteps of Kari Lake. And they're saying that either the voters voted out fraud or that their efforts for the past 8 years to stop voter fraud was successful, and that's why Trump was able to win, and that's why we don't have to talk about election fraud anymore. If that were the case, though, we would still have to question the legitimacy of the same day claims of election fraud if they truly believed that it was their efforts that caused the transparency in voting to suddenly happen within a few hours, although a few hours prior, we were still believing that there was fraud happening. So what do you think? Think about the multiple sources of information. Think about what would make a party collectively join to promote one single message, with that single message being to negatively impact your emotions to then trigger you into a specific voting behavior. True democracy is accepting the vote of Americans even when you lose. True democracy is not creating damaging lies when you lose or trying to manipulate voters using lies when you lose. It's not the spreading of disinformation for years as a strategy to win an election, even when it means that others may be seriously harmed or even killed. That is not democracy. That is hypocrisy. So when you vote on facts and not conspiracy. And please do not allow your mind or your vote to be manipulated. And one way to recognize that this is happening to you is that if you become emotionally triggered by listening to a news station or a political candidate, then use that as a sign that you are being manipulated. And no one manipulates you for your benefit. They manipulate you for their benefit. So consider multiple sources of information when you find yourself emotionally triggered, especially if you feel yourself becoming angry and consistently angry when you're listening to one news station, news channel, or news source. So use your emotions as a guide and use that to then also consider multiple sources of information and multiple sides of an argument. Also, remember that your voice may be the only voice of reason in your family or community. And I included research links in the description of this episode to help you more easily recognize if you have been the victim of political manipulation in this recent election, or to help others recognize if they have been. So with your voice, be sure to promote the unbiased insights that we discuss here, and please continue this conversation using science and love.
Walk the path of life. And if you run